Hey everybody, welcome back to the Hand Toolery. My name is Andrew Malacy, and today I'm going to be making a display frame for a newspaper that I've had for going on about 30 years now. And this newspaper has a picture of my favorite basketball player at the time, I think everybody's favorite basketball player, which was Michael Jordan, just after he won his first championship with the Bulls. And so I thought it was high time that I finally put this in a frame because it's been kicking around forever, either in a frame that's way too big and doesn't work for it and just looks bad, or just out in the open and suffering to the elements, I guess you could say. So anyways, I'm going to go ahead and make a frame for this end of this video. And as you can see, I just started with a board. It was kind of rough. I had only flattened one side and one edge. But that's really enough because all I really needed to have was just a reference face and a reference edge. And then basically I just went ahead and went at it with the rabbet plane here. I set the fence and I referenced off the good side. I don't know if you can tell, but right around the middle of the board, there's a hollow in it, there's a low spot. And so I basically just left it because there's really no reason to take it out. And here's that low spot I was telling you about. It really doesn't affect me, even though yes, the plane is going to register against it, the plane fence, but not a problem. Here I'm marking the depth, or just basically how much of a piece I'm going to cut off for the actual frame itself. And I should have done this before I actually cut the rabbet, and you'll see when I make the next pieces, I do mark the depth that before I actually cut it off. Here I'm using my trusty Diston rip saw, and if you just watch me, I'll give you most of the cut here. It goes quite quickly. It's more like I'm taking my time to make sure I cut accurately rather than the saw is that slow. And so yes, this is 1 inch thick walnut here, and it makes fairly easy work of it. I wasn't really tired at the end of this rip cut at all. It's about 3 feet long, this board, and like I said, it's just not that bad. After cutting off that one strip, which is going to become a piece of the frame itself, now I have to clean up the surface of the main board that's left over. And so here I'm using my Stanley number 6, and I'm taking a pretty heavy cut because I just want to get it trued up real quick. But also because sometimes I don't cut straight or my blade isn't exactly lined up, I'm always checking for square so that way I'm not chewing up too much material out of square, right? And since everything looks square and flat, I just used my straight edge. Now I'm coming back with my Stanley number 5 with a little bit of a lighter cut just to go ahead and clean it up. And a final check to make sure it's square, and we're good to go. Here I am marking the depth before I go ahead and cut the rabbet. That way I can have the depth equally marked on both sides quite easily. And that'll give me a little bit more to go by whenever I'm cutting the rip cut. And also what I like to do is, whenever possible, just mark the actual line I need to cut. And now we're back to cutting. Just a simple cut, a matter of a minute or so, and that piece is ready to go. And just to give you an idea of what I'm doing, again, I cut that piece off that I just cut the rabbet in. As a bit of reminder, the proper technique on these, or the technique that everybody says you should use, is that you start on the very end of the board and you kind of get that established, and then you slowly work the plane back more and more and more, eventually until you're taking full length shavings. So what I like to do is sort of exaggerate the end and move to the middle, and then finally to the very front of the board. I've got to go ahead and clean up the other pieces that I cut off that are going to actually make the frame. So, using the same Stanley 6 with a heavy cut, and I've got it clamped in the vise and just going to go through them one by one. I only cut 3 pieces because the 2 longer sides will be 1 piece, and then the 2 shorter ends or sides will be half of another piece. And with those pieces ready to go, we're going to start actually cutting out the pieces for the frame. So remember that you have to start on one end with a 45-degree angle because you're going to miter it. It doesn't really matter where it is or how long it is. Just cut off a minimal amount so that way you leave enough of the main piece to get the length you need. So I've actually just hooked my tape measure on the miter box I've got here, which I like this little plastic thing. It's a little light duty, but it works. And I hooked the tape measure and just mark it straight on the piece. I like to clamp down the piece and then just go at it with the 45 angle on the miter box, and it works great. Because any differences you have in the length of your pieces will cause your frame to be out of square no matter what you do. It's really important that rather than cutting to a specific measurement, you need to cut to the length of the piece you already made. So that's what I just did. I just lined up the 2 pieces side by side. They both already had 1 corner, miter corner cut on them. And then I just marked it directly on the other piece. And then from there, I will actually just take it to the shooting board and make sure they're exactly the same length. Now, as you're going to the shooting board to clean up all the edges, you want to remember that it's not just about making it look good on the edge or having a good surface. You have to make sure that it's square and that you also have exactly the same length among all your corresponding parts. So your 2 sides have to be the same on the long sides, and then the 2 shorter sides have to be exactly the same. So this is where you want to spend a little bit extra time making sure everything is perfectly square by taking across the body of the actual piece. And then your glue up should be rather straightforward. When I do a glue up of a frame, I like to use like a piece of cordage to work as a clamp. I've never actually tried to use the tape method where you tape the corners and sort of fold it all together. I'm sure that would actually be better, but I've never remembered to do it. I just don't remember. So maybe next frame, I'm sure there'll be more. I'll give that one a try, but this seems to work fine. I just pull it tight, tie it off, and then add in some wedges, as you can see. What I do is I add these little offcuts to really pull it tight, because otherwise it's just hard to get it tight enough without distorting it. After a few hours, the glue is dry. I'm just going to remove all the spacers, and from there I'm going to take it over, and being very careful, I'm going to take my plane to it and just clean up the top side of the corners or any other faces that need it, because I find it's easier to plane away any glue rather than sand it away. And here we go. Looks pretty sturdy at this point. Now I'm being very careful to line up the edges of the miters or the corners right between the dogs there. I don't want to put too much stress outside of that. So I'm trying to put all the stress on the actual piece itself and not on the joint. And I've got this plane really, really sharp, and I'm trying to basically follow the corner, and that way I don't have any extra tear out. So this little circular motion is kind of going around the corner. This isn't to make everything perfect because I'm going to come back over it with some sandpaper. It's, again, mostly just to remove glue and make everything flush. For the sides here, you can see I had to clamp a piece to the bench that'll allow me to plane this and support it, because I don't want to stress these glue joints. Because if you've seen my other videos, you know I don't really use splines in my picture frames. Not trying to be a risk taker or edgy or anything. It's just not easy for me to put splines in with hand tools only, and so I don't use them. Here I am with some 120 grits, and then after I go ahead and I do the whole frame with this sanding block because it helps me get nice crisp edges, I take 500 grit, which you'll see in a second. Notice I'm constantly supporting it. I'm really making sure it doesn't flex. I'm not pushing too hard on it, that I'm not stressing the joints. And this is just another safety precaution here. What I'm doing here is I've got a piece, I've put the flat edge of the sandpaper up against the very end of this piece, and then I can work it into the corners. So again, I'm just doing everything as detailed as I can, trying not to stress the joints. And here I've got the piece a little bit angled, and I come right up to the line where the miters meet, and then after I've got that sanded, I do the rest of the piece. This is just wipe on poly. It's a satin finish. I put on 2 coats of this, and after that dries, you'll see I use paste wax, and that's basically my finishing protocol for this. In the past, I would use a screwdriver to put in the glazing points, but now I use this tack puller, and because it's got that bent angle of attack, it works much better. And so what you do is you just you have to press down on all the backing surfaces, then you sort of slide it in and make it engage the wood so it holds everything down, and then you just wiggle it back and forth while you're supporting the outer edge of the frame, and everything goes quite easily. They're quite cheap, and you can load it up with them and it holds it secure. I didn't show you this, but I've lined the back of the frame with double-sided tape, and that's what I prefer to use. It holds quite well, but at the same time it's not extremely permanent, so if I need to rip it off I can. But I like doing this. It really makes it look nice, and I use this block of wood to just make sure the adhesive on the tape sticks to everything. I've done a number of different methods to try and remove this paper on the back, and this is just my marking knife. But whatever you do, you want to make sure you don't cut into your frame. So one thing I found that works well, but it's a little more cumbersome and you could cut yourself, is using just the razor blade from a utility knife. But this knife of mine has a sharp tip because it's a marking knife, but it doesn't really have a sharp rest of the blade. So this has worked fine. To install the hanging hardware, I just find the exact midpoint because the actual sawtooth hanging thing has a little indentation on it that you just sit right over it. Then I mark the holes with a pencil, drill them out, and add in some nails. It couldn't be easier. After this point, you just add your name tag and you're done.